We thought it was routine. That was the first lie I told myself the minute we turned off the county road and the forest closed around us like a curtain. The Appalachian Blackout had knocked out whole swaths of the grid 3 nights before. Phone lines were spotty, towns were breathing on emergency generators, and nobody expected anything more exotic than downed transformers and frozen water pumps. We were told to check a structural assessment at an underground site tucked into the mountains, an old Cold War scar that still got maintenance money and a little paperwork when the lights went out. Routine, they said. Inspect foundation bolts, test emergency lighting, make sure the generators ran on backup. Do it, sign the form, go home. My name is Ethan Ramirez. I was a sergeant then, 32, one of those career types who'd learned to let the hum of procedure stead him when everything else frayed. My team was small. Private Miguel Torres on comms and logistics, Sergeant Javier Luna as my security lead, and a civilian containment specialist attached for the trip, Dr. Samuel Moreno, a short, exact man in a lab coat who smelled faintly of formalin despite the cold mountain air. Our on-site contact was Colonel Marcus Hayes, competent and blunt in the way that comes from years of moving problems up and down the chain instead of letting them fester. We drove slow. The Appalachian Road was 1 lane in stretches, carved between rhododendron and rock face, and the night air had that wet, iron smell that comes before a storm. The blackout had thinned traffic to nothing. We passed a gas station lit by a single lantern and a diner with an open sign that buzzed like a wounded insect. Somewhere down the valley, generational porch lights blinked as people lit candles and checked on relatives. That domestic darkness felt like both a blessing and an opportunity to people who preferred shadows. It made movement less conspicuous, it made answers less visible. We got to the access gate at 2140. The guard who let us through was young, eyes too bright for someone who'd signed a lifetime of secrecy with a salary and a handshake. He didn't ask questions we hadn't already been told not to answer. Our paperwork said structural integrity assessment, a phrase that fits into neat boxes and carries no moral weight. The facility, listed on no public maps we'd seen, sat like a blunt tooth at the side of a ridge. Low buildings, vent stacks, a reinforced door in the slope where a highway used to disappear and reappear in the maps as if an artist had smeared a mountain. Colonel Hayes met us at the perimeter in a windbreaker that did nothing to hide the way he watched everything twice. He gave the briefing in the sort of clipped voice that leaves no room for argument. Blackout exposure tests showed abnormal load variance in the facility's backup circuits, he said. We don't have confirmation of damage, but sensors read anomalies in the lower conduits.
We're clearing a team for inspection and repair oversight. You report mechanical, electrical, and structural. Do not open any sealed compartments beyond level authorization. If you find anything unusual beyond your remit, you radio up and wait for instructions. There was that last line in the brief, common in every job description where one hand is told to stay clean while the other does the dirty work. Do not open often means we don't want to know more than you have to. I nodded. So did Miguel and Javier. Dr. Moreno adjusted his glasses, as if the exactness of his lenses might make reality sit still enough for us to see it. We moved in through the airlock at 2203. The door cycled in 2 dull thumps, and the smell of something like ozone and old oil washed over us. The access corridor was a tight, concrete throat with stamped numbers and conduit racks. Emergency panels blazed orange and green. Their LEDs looked small and ridiculous in the cavernous dark. We checked our gear the way soldiers do. Light batteries, 2 spare radios, hard helmets, a pair of respirators that hung around our necks like anxious ornaments. The facility's badge reader blinked, chewed our orders, and spat us into a service elevator with the gentle indifference only machines have. The elevator rode us down in measured intervals. Level markings changed. Base, 1, 2, 3. The descent felt slower than it should. The cables hummed and the car shook in a way I later learned to catalog as bearing wear. Not dangerous on paper, but something your hands remember. The temperature dropped as we went down. The air became denser, metallic on the tongue. The environmental monitor clipped to Dr. Moreno's pack pinged green, and then amber as it measured humidity, particulate count, and a faint unresolved spike in carbon compounds that didn't match anything in its memory bank. He kept his eyes on the readout like a man watching a pulse. We opened into level 3 at 2216. The whole place had a heart of fluorescent light and institutional silence. Hallways branched like veins. Doors spaced every 20 feet had label plates, most of them generic, storage, mech, archive. But some were blank, their plates sanded clean. We signed logs, took a few baseline photos for the head office, and walked the perimeter per Colonel Hayes' instructions. Everything was functional. Pumps hummed. Emergency lights flickered to life when we tripped breakers and then settled into a steady, capable glow. We tested egress signs, checked bolt torques on the support beams, and recorded the generator's run-in time after the blackout. details normal enough that I could feel my shoulders uncurling into habit. Javier worked the security sweep, Miguel was on comms and data logging, and I kept moving through a checklist I've memorized out of habit. Structural, electrical, environmental, report. Dr. Moreno wandered with us like a human thermometer, taking samples and noting anomalies. The first oddity wasn't dramatic. It was a door at the end of a corridor that didn't make sense. Too heavy, thicker than the others, and bolted into a frame that chipped paint like an old tooth. It had no label. There was a keypad with dead LED digits. Sealed, someone had chalked on it in small, neat letters, sometime after the metal had cooled. Hydraulic, strange murmurs behind. A cold draft brushed past our faces as if the door breathed. We ran the database query on a battered terminal, fingers sharp against keyboards that smelled faintly of fried plastic. The schematics we pulled up showed 4 primary levels, service ducts, and a maintenance crawl that accounted for all major structures. But the terminal's structural overlay also had a narrow, roughly sketched corridor that mushroomed beneath the site, 5th level. It wasn't in the printed documentation Colonel Hayes had given us. It wasn't listed on the paper maps in our hands. Someone had drawn it in on the digital schematic as a thin, unauthorized line, level 5, unmapped, access restricted. "That's not supposed to be there," Miguel said. His voice had that small human tremor you get when you realize your world is bigger than the authorities' version of it. Dr. Moreno peered at the screen with the same look I'd seen on interns who'd read something in a journal that made them feel like they'd glimpsed a state secret. We tried the badge reader code. The keypad remained inert. A maintenance manual suggested a mechanical override in emergencies, a lever, a physical key tucked into an on-site locker for authorized personnel. Colonel Hayes' orders were clear. Do not open any sealed compartments beyond level authorization. The words pressed at my ribs like a thing trying to keep me from swallowing. We were supposed to leave the 5th level alone, but curiosity is a muscle you don't notice flexing until it's too late. We found the key by accident. Not a key in the cliché sense, but a maintenance override tucked into an otherwise innocuous storage room, a pallet of inert supplies, a rag-streaked toolbox, and behind a stack of labeled crates, emergency keys, do not remove, a metal hide that would make better sense in a locksmith's drawer than in a government storeroom. Someone had turned their back on protocol and leaned a small mechanical key into a corner. No ID plates, no chain of custody, just the key, cold and waiting. I remember the exact weight of it. Small, satisfying in a way keys are, function compacted into metal. I should have turned it in on site. I could have taken a photo and moved on. Javier looked at me and shrugged a soldier's shrug, the kind that says, if something fails, we'll be blamed later, and if we don't know, we'll be blamed for not knowing. The team moved like a single organism now. We carried tools, paper forms, portable lights, and maybe 3 instinctive arguments about whether to proceed. Dr. Moreno didn't argue. He was enthralled. We opened the sealed door at 2302. It didn't swing on a hinge so much as surrender from behind a machine that had been quiet for years. It gave us a breath of cold that tasted of decades, stale air that had filtered through carbon filters and kept a place preserved. The corridor beyond the door dropped another degree in temperature and narrowed. The sound changed. The facility's hum became a distant, organized chorus, and close at hand, there was only the soft mechanical ticking of pressure regulators. It was darker than the other levels, despite the emergency lights. We moved 6 feet at a time, our flashlights carving cones in the black that were immediately swallowed. Miguel clicked on a handheld environmental monitor. It lit up reluctantly. Oxygen nominal, CO2 low, trace organics present that didn't conform to any normal building contamination signature. His fingers flew over the keypad and then slowed. "There's a negative pressure gradient," he said. "This section's being held below ambient by an active system. Whatever's down here is intended to stay in, not get out." That phrase, intended to stay in, felt heavier than the keys in my pocket. We found level 4 first, decontamination airlocks, unlocked cabinets full of sterile suits, and lab rooms with counters where instruments sat like sleeping animals. Formaldehyde, ethanol, and sterilization lights hummed, as if the place was on a nightly schedule of its own. Shelves held vials, rows and rows, each vial tagged and cataloged like a library's spine, their contents faded and labeled with codes that Dr. Moreno translated in a dead, efficient voice. He called them archived biological samples, and his throat closed on the words like someone who had said worse things for a living and learned to swallow afterward. "Everything's cataloged," he said. "No obvious pathogens, but look here.
Tissue samples that don't match any database I've got. Cellular architecture, look. He pointed to a magnified image on his portable viewer. The cells had structures that curved and layered in ways more intricate than human histology. He hedged. Unclassified. Unknown origin. We moved further, checking doors, tagging anomalies, taking the sort of photographs that satisfy paperwork and do nothing for your conscience. At one point, we opened a refrigeration unit and found row upon row of crates with cryo blankets. Inside, vials slept in foam racks like fossils. Labels indicated storage dates that predated the facility's decommission orders by decades. They had been moved here, someone had thought, and left in a long, cold pause. There were containment cells, small rooms with reinforced walls and observation windows. Behind the glass, where you'd expect to find none of consequence in a structural sweep, there were cylindrical tanks, vertical and lined with instruments, tubing, electrode arrays, calibers that reflected the light like thin, coiled veins. Inside each tank, a shadow lay folded against itself.
The liquid inside was clear and refracted the light into soft halos, the way an aquarium can turn a lamp into a sun. Their shapes were not human in any comfortable way. Limbs that seemed to bend at odd angles, cranial structures that widened like the bell of a trumpet. They were in stasis, I thought at first, the way a lab keeps specimens suspended when they mean only to study them. But one of them turned its head. A face, or what my brain called a face, tilted, and an eye found us through the glass. Not aggressive, not predatory. It looked as if it cataloged the light itself, and then cataloged us. It is a funny thing what you remember during a moment like that. Memory compresses many small things into one heavy note. The hiss of the chill system, the speculative whisper from Miguel behind me, the way my hand went to the butt of my rifle without thinking, the cold that crawled from my chest down my arms. But mostly, I recall the look. It was intelligent. It was patient. It was not a mirror of human emotion, but it held an interest that felt like recognition. For a blink, the glass between us was not glass, but a screen, and something on the other side turned and looked at me the way a classroom looks at a teacher who has just learned the wrong answer. Unknown biological specimen, Dr. Moreno said, as if the phrase could settle an entire universe into a taxonomy. His voice was steady. He had taken in the morphology in 20 seconds and rearranged it into words. To him, this was data. To me, it was more like a confession. We logged everything. We took photographs. We annotated labels with pen and ink in the physical logbook because digital entries could be altered and someone someday might need a literal, scrawled witness. I remember the light from my pen lamp catching on the condensation at the inner edge of the glass and making a halo around the creature's head. Miguel's hand trembled when he lifted the camera. This is where the memory wedges. Protocol wants me to go back up, radio this in, and wait. We were told, as the colonel's briefing emphasized, not to break authorized seals. We were supposed to document and report. But behind the tanks, through a narrow maintenance tangle that looked like a cluster of intestines, there was a hatch just beyond the observation corridor. It was small, not meant for people so much as maintenance arms and cabling. The schematic, if you squinted past the sanctioned overlays, showed a sub-passage that did not exist on paper, a maintenance access that led into a deeper shaft. Whoever had drawn that line had done so with the pencil of someone who knew a secret and didn't trust the institution enough to write it down cleanly. I felt the tug of an old, dangerous curiosity that had gotten me out of sleeping billets to see more of the world. We were not supposed to go farther. We were supposed to secure the level and leave what was under the seal to people with names and paperwork that we did not possess.
But the hatch wasn't locked. It wasn't open entirely, it was a seam. Someone had welded the maintenance rail shut and then pried it back enough to fit a tool. There were scrape marks around the rim and a ring of rust that spoke of time and half-hearted repairs. It was, in other words, a half-collapsed secret. "We should call this up," Javier said. He kept his voice low but firm. "We document and we leave." Colonel Hayes had said, report and wait. That was the soldier's law. And yet, standing there, with the eyes pressing at me through thick glass, I heard a different sound, the low, practical hum of my own will turned toward knowing. There are moments in military service where rule broken is necessary to prevent a different, worse rule from holding sway. There are moments where disobedience is an action in favor of truth. I have held both opinions in my hands and have been ashamed of both. We passed the hatch between us. The opening was tight. My shoulder brushed rust. My flashlight caught on metal mesh. The air beyond the hatch was colder still than the refrigeration rooms, and smelled of something faintly sweet, like the memory of autumn fruit, and something else I couldn't name. Miguel's environmental monitor chirped a warning, but readout values were indecipherable by design. The sensors had been tuned to detect a range of things, but these signatures didn't match any normal contamination pattern. Dr. Moreno's face had gone pale. For a scientist, the pale is either the color of possibility or the color of terror. He would later tell me that his hand shook because the tissue samples and the morphology combined made his professional ethics shout at him from within. In that moment, he just kept pocketing photographs, fingers steady, eyes wide. We moved down the maintenance shaft like men who had skipped a prayer for good luck. The lights were sparse. Every sound was exaggerated: the scuff of a boot, the clink of a metal rung, the distant growl of equipment. The shaft bent and then opened into a wider corridor, with walls lined in a matte black finish that absorbed our light. There were bulkheads ahead with placards I couldn't read from that first angles. A bank office's console blinked at the far end with a keypad that didn't match the other gear we'd seen. The whole place felt like the underbelly of something much larger. At about 2348, we came to the control room for level 5. It was an amphitheater of monitors, most of which were in sleep mode. A central console dominated the room, its screens dead with a film of dust. On one of the monitors, a security feed glitched into life for a second and showed a row of tanks, cylinders lined like graves, backlit by an ancillary glow. The feed cut, snapped to black, and then came back with no image at all. The timestamp on the bottom corner was corrupted and showed a year digit that didn't make sense.
Whoever had stood at this console last had left in a hurry, or had been told to leave and had obeyed. There were doors, heavy ones, biometrics, a redundancy of locks and a web of intercoms that could have handled a small city's coordination. A warning plaque above the main door read, in block letters, "Authorized personnel only, biological hazard." Beneath that, someone had taped an old faded notice, "Emergency access, contact oversight." Contact oversight, a bureaucratic euphemism that dilutes responsibility across so many shoulders you can never find the one that should have bled. We were standing in a room designed to make people believe that systems kept the world safe. For all those systems, there was a human slipperiness about them. The half-open hatch, the blonde metal key in the corner, the corrupted timestamp. Secrets, when they grow old enough, begin to learn how to be discovered. My radio crackled. It was low static at first, then a voice that made me look down. "Sergeant Ramirez, report," Colonel Hayes said. "Status?" I looked at my squad, and at the console, and at the row of tanks that had flashed and gone blank. The thing in the nearest tank had angled its head in such a way that its wide lid of eye now looked almost like a pupil, a deliberate focus. It might have been asleep. It might have been studying a tiny insect crawling on the glass. Or it might have been trying to decide whether the flesh beyond the glass bore the scent of a threat or a kin from a planet whose grammar we did not know. "Level 5 access," I said into the radio, keeping my voice flat. "Found sealed hatch breached. Observed biological storage and immobilized specimens. Requesting further instructions." There is a safety in asking for permission. It creates a paper trail, a line of sight that can justify later action. But sometimes asking for permission is a way to avoid facing what you already know you will do. There was a long silence on the line, and it was the kind of silence you learn to respect. Then Colonel Hayes' voice, quieter. "Stand fast. Do not open any primary containment. Secure the corridor and maintain current posture. Send visual locks." We complied. We set up a perimeter of the kind soldiers use to make a spot neat and cataloged. We recorded everything into numbers and photographs, and Miguel's hands steadied as he typed. Dr. Moreno took a vial from his pocket and placed it against the glass through a miniature sampling port he released with surgical gentleness. The liquid swirled and registered a chemical signature the printer spat out in a blocky paper. He handed me the strip and stood very still, like someone who had said a forbidden prayer and forgotten the words. "No known pathogens," he said. "Biological signatures are inconsistent with any database in my clearance." It was then that the lights flicked. At first, I thought someone upstairs had tripped an automated switchover.
I have since learned that the why of our decisions matters less than the fact we make them. There is no comfort in that. We staged in the entry corridor at 0012, boots against cold concrete, radios hot and messages sent. The facility's ventilation made a low, consistent noise. Off to one side, A maintenance door shuttered and locked behind us, and somewhere deeper there was the clang of a heavy mechanism that didn't belong to any generator we recognized. Outside, the Appalachian night had thickened into an absolute black. When the blackout had happened 3 days before, people had told stories of city lights dying like a hand falling away. Now our world had the same feature on a smaller scale, an underworld that switched off its own lights and kept the surface from knowing. We were told to wait. We waited. We logged what we had seen and did our best to make it into data. Timestamps, photo references, descriptors. I wrote in the margins of a paper logbook with a pencil that smudged. In the close heat of our small group, jokes broke through like surface bubbles, offhand remarks about being in a lab that looked like it was built for science fiction, about the oddity of our own orders. Humor in a group like ours is the human way to make edges bearable. It didn't last long. There was, slowly, a sound that didn't belong to the facility's old mechanical heartbeat. Through the ventilation and the recessed wall speakers came a voice, low, centralized, a man speaking in the kinds of directives that come from very far up the chain. All non-essential remainers are to clear immediate area. Containment teams authorizing minimal interaction. Prepare for transfer. We were not non-essential, the logic of our mission said. We were dates and numbers in a claim about structural inspection. But when the voice issued orders, everyone took them. People of rank are habits we cannot easily break. They are the grammar we have trained ourselves to obey. We folded ourselves into that grammar the way a blanket folds into place. A transfer. The word implied that something would be moved through our corridor, passed under our watch, shrouded by its own classification. The idea of shipping these specimens anywhere, of moving them like freight between vaults and laboratories, made a noise at the back of my throat that I couldn't swallow. We were briefed to stay put until a specialized team arrived. The team, according to the voice, would be here shortly. The word shortly in military time can stretch. It can mean 10 minutes or 3 hours, depending on the number of hands that keep moving the clock. We had little more than each other and the tanks breathing the night. Miguel slumped against a pipe, face shadowed. Javier cleaned his rifle with methodical patience, a soldier's way of putting his hands to work so his mind can be still. Dr.
Moreno sat with his back against concrete and stared into the dark as if he could memorize the exact contour of the thing that had looked back at us. I took a cigarette I'd never start and thought about the fact that we were surrounded by lab equipment and sterile air, and yet my hands shook enough that the simple mechanical act of lighting a match felt like a rebellion. The match flared and went out. I didn't smoke it. The cigarette stayed between my fingers like a tiny, useless torch. My radio buzzed, and I keyed it. "Status update?" I said. "Any sign of the transfer team?" Static. Then a voice I didn't recognize said, "ETA 10 minutes, hold position." 10 minutes stretches like a rubber band under stress. We tried to fill it with tasks, double-checking bolts, scanning for residual radiation spikes, none, cataloging specimen labels. We held our flashlights like exam lamps over the tanks and took extra photos, the camera's flashes making tiny storms in the glass. It was at that moment, 11 minutes in, the margin of long more than the promise, that the nearest tank's sensor array blinked red, the indicator that read stasis field, the phrase itself like a promise, dropped from 100% to 73%, then to 61%. The environmental console chimed in a thin, mechanized wail. Miguel's monitor pelted numbers across its screen like pages falling from a book. "Field collapse," Dr. Moreno said. The words were a scientist's worst heartbeat. "Localized energy dispersion. It's a containment destabilization." "How?" Javier started, then cut himself off and moved. The room became a choreography of motion, us, the human chain, moving with rehearsed smallness to check gauges and seals, for reasons that were now more about human failure than mechanical anomaly. We tried to patch the reading with a field manual. There are always ways to patch, but the console's readouts were stubbornly wrong. The tank's inner fluid quivered, as if a wave had passed through it. The creature inside unfurled, long gestures made in slow intervals the way something that has slept a long time stretches. The eye that met me then wasn't the same study as before. It seemed to me, perhaps absurdly, perhaps truly, to have a comprehension of situation and a question about the ethics of observation. It lifted a limb and splayed a palm against the inside of the glass. There was no banging, no violence. Its touch was almost a scientific gesture, an experiment in contact and response. The glass, which had been nothing but a barrier there all along, hummed. For the first time, the thing in the tank looked like a mirror into something other than flesh. I had the absurd thought that it was as astonished by our existence as we were frightened by its. For a breath, the space between was not concrete and polymer, but a relation. That contact, simple, sad, astonishing, hung in the air like a question mark. The red lights kept their rhythm. The console's readout nosedived to below 20%.
An automated voice, clipped and emotionless, announced, "Primary containment failure imminent. Initiate emergency decant." We moved because we were guided to move, because orders had weight, because the world is built on small automatic reactions that keep chaos from swallowing you whole. We pushed toward the observation glass to see what would happen if a delicate biological field gave way. We made ourselves witnesses to a thing that had never been meant for human eyes in the wood smoke of an Appalachian night. And we were not the last people to witness anything that night. The console screamed like a throat being cut. Reading scrolled into reds and then into a ragged line of nonsense numbers, as if the instruments themselves had given up trying to describe what was happening. The tank's outer skin flexed. I remember thinking absurdly that an aquarium glass might bow before a wave. This was the inverse, pressure from inside, a swelling against the world. The creature's palm flattened against the inner surface and then pushed. The glass didn't crack with a cinematic crash. It flexed, and then the seal along a seam let go with a long, wet sigh that sounded worse than any shattering. Fluid beaded, and then streamed down the observation pane in ribbons. For a heartbeat, I thought stasis fluid would behave like water. It didn't. It peeled off in thin, viscous sheets, forming strings that clung to the polymer like cobwebs. The creature slipped, not clumsily, but like a thing turning out of sleep, and something in its shoulders caught on a conduit. We were trained so that our first motion is to secure. My hand reached for the radio, mouth already forming the words Colonel Hayes would want. Containment breach, level 5, immediate. The radio became a useless thing. Static like ocean spray swamped the channel. Miguel cursed, and then wasn't heard again over the hiss. His voice was swallowed as other sounds took shape. The alarm, if you could call it that, it had been a background mechanical insistence until now, went feral. Sirens layered over one another, a high shriek meant for human ears, and a lower, warbling tone intended to kick systems into automated lockdown. Bulkheads slammed, chain-driven doors dropped from the ceiling and boomed shut, and the air filled with the smell of electrics toasted under stress, and the sweet, sharp tang of whatever had been inside those tanks. The first specimen didn't make a beeline for us. It didn't lumber or lunge. It used the infrastructure like a map, a limb, jointed in ways our bodies are not, wrapped around a maintenance rail and slid along it with a kind of practiced certainty. Where the tanks were arrayed in a neat grid, service conduits ran like veins, and the creature navigated them the way a diver navigates currents. It moved away from the observation gallery, toward the darker arteries of the facility, as if seeking a place that whispered of open air. Then came a sound I still hear in the small hours. Metal struck metal, a wet, wet thud that meant containment foam hitting wrong. The automated injectors on adjacent tanks tried to compensate, flooding the bays with gels and fields, but the failure propagated like rot. A panel popped. I saw a second silhouette wrench free and disappear into a ventilation shaft. I slammed my shoulder into the observation glass and felt a tremor run through the concrete as other systems in the level labored under panic. "Down! Down!" Javier barked, and we fell into a pattern I have repeated in nightmares since. Instinctive, ritualized actions meant to keep people alive. Miguel grabbed the nearest flare light and began to sweep the ducts. I moved toward the maintenance access we had come through and tried the hatch. It stuck. The welds had shifted with the strain. My fingers slid on cold metal as I worked the release, the taste of iron in my mouth. Dr. Moreno shouted something that could have been a direction and could have been a prayer. He was crouched near one of the tank consoles, fingers scrabbling at the keyboard. His breath came fast. The console displayed a cascade of errors I couldn't parse. His face was lit by a pale green that made him look like a surgeon under cuts of light. "No, no, no," he said, and for the first time he sounded younger than his years. "The fields, compensator loops fried. If we can't get a manual override." "Manual?" Javier repeated as if testing the word for strength. "Where's manual access?" We ripped through panels. Manuals are a soldier's blessing, the printed, physical thing. We found an emergency toolkit with a laminated card tucked in. Someone, decades ago, had thought a human hand would be more reliable than remote command. The card had a sequence for manual field re-engage, an 8-step procedure that required 2 people at separate consoles to complete simultaneously to prevent accidental interplay. We tried to coordinate. Our radios were fragmenting into static, but hand signals survive in the dark. We started the manual re-engage. Electromechanical clunks answered our motions. The stasis field flickered from 12% to 26%. The nearest tank throbbed like a heartbeat, and then shuddered as the field reattained a temporary hold. We exhaled in a ragged chorus. For a moment, the world smoothed into the procedure and response rhythm I preferred for comfort. It was a false lull. Through a side duct that shouldn't have been large enough for anything but wiring, another figure rolled out as if the architecture itself was sending a child down a drain. It hit the floor between us and the stairwell and came up in a crouch, too quick, too precise. Its skin, if skin is the right word, was netted with thin ridges where muscle met fiber. It looked towards us with a speed so fast it made my head swim, then darted.
I saw the outline of a headlamp swing, a twin shadow, and the thing was gone, through a maintenance access we had not noticed. "You see that?" Miguel said, voice sharp. Blood specked his sleeve where some metal had nicked him when he fell. He didn't seem to notice. "They know their way around." "They've been here longer than we have," Dr. Moreno whispered. "Observation, conditioning." We had no weapons designed for locking down things we couldn't name. Our rifles are meant for people with bone and blood that look like ours on x-rays. The rounds we used would do something, hurt, maybe kill, but they would not close a structural tear or a breached stasis field. Yet combat training doesn't disappear when you realize your opponent isn't human. Javier barked an order. We moved. The level beyond the observation corridor had alternate exits, service stairs that ran toward the surface, and a freight elevator that had maintenance tags older than my father's marriage. We took the stairs. The concrete felt warm underfoot from the facility's failing systems. Overhead, the ducts rumbled like distant thunder. At 0047, the intercom, which had been choked with static, cleared long enough for a voice to cut through, flat and professional, carrying authority like a coat. All units, secure non-combatants, specialized containment teams inbound, do not engage beyond level prescribed measures. It was the sort of voice that pats procedure onto the situation, the sort that makes you trust a structure, even as it collapses. Containment teams inbound, I echoed under my breath. Inbound could mean an hour. It could mean never. The facility had become a giant animal with a fever. We had bandages and a wrench. It had mazes and knowledge. We moved down a service stair and past a maintenance closet where someone had left a stack of crates labeled with a symbol I didn't recognize. One crate lay open, and inside, swaddled in foam, was a compact device with a label, Indefinito, so official-looking it hurt. Dr. Moreno picked up a corner of the foam and squinted at the device like a man looking for a pulse. "Field injection interface," he read aloud. "If we had the right calibrator, we could—" He didn't finish the sentence. Footsteps echoed from below, heavy, organized, outside our rhythm. They were not ours. They sounded like a unit. They sounded like authorization. When they arrived, they did not look like the facility maintenance crew. They moved in pairs like dancers, efficient and practiced. Black uniforms, helmets with visors, insignia that were deliberately unreadable. Their leader moved with a certainty that fields recede in my mind. He didn't salute. He didn't need to. He spoke into his collar. "Stand down," he ordered. "Local unit, you will step back to staging area and hand over all logs and media. Do not alter physical evidence. This area is now under specialized command." Colonel Hayes arrived then, his hair damp, eyes tired but sharpened by anger.
He caught my eye and gave a motionless half-nod, the kind men use to say both thanks and apology at once. The team's leader, a person whose rank and name I never learned in terms of the official file we later signed, peeled off a small squad and advanced into the observation hub with surgical intent. "Sergeant Ramirez," he said, and my mouth marked my name as if on a roster. He didn't ask if we had seen anything. He already knew. "You and your team step into debrief. You will surrender all personal recordings and written notes. Anything you have taken stays with us." I wanted to argue that we'd followed procedure, that we'd tried to secure the level, that we'd fought to hold a stasis field with a paper manual and 2 sets of hands. Instead, I felt my throat close and nodded. Orders take shape like gravity in a room.
You feel them, and you drop into them. We moved to the staging area. People wearing the blank uniforms cleared the bay with speed. Men in white coats I didn't know hovered at a distance, clipboard in hand. One of them caught Dr. Moreno's eye and said, "Doctor, you'll accompany us. We need samples intact. This is critical." Dr. Moreno looked at me as if asking permission from the air. No one gave it. I watched him go, hands in his pockets, the kind of man walking into a referral who was both excited and terrified. That was the last time I saw him without an order to be silent. In the debrief, we were grilled, softly and then sharply. They did not shout names. They asked about times, about access, about whether we had moved anything. Miguel's camera was taken, Javier's notes confiscated. They handed us a small packet of forms in triplicate. Legalese moved across pages like a tide. Non-disclosure, chain of custody, classification. The forms were thick with the kind of ink that tries to become your thoughts. We were told not to tell anyone, under penalty of legal and criminal repercussions, and to wait for further instructions. I signed. It's astonishing, at the time, what obedience looks like when it is wrapped in a piece of paper. Something else happened after the debrief that had no paperwork. A meeting, curtained off, closed to our presence. Colonel Hayes walked in, closed the door, and then he left with a face older by 10 years. He didn't speak to me for a long time after that. He smiled once, near the vehicle, and it didn't reach his eyes. We were issued reassignment orders the next day. Small print in gray boxes said, "Routine reassignment for operational security." Miguel was given a night post miles away. Javier was sent to a base that had nothing to do with his prior duties. I was asked to transfer my clearance. Dr. Moreno never returned to field attachments. He was moved to a research complex whose name on the itinerary read, "Indefinido," an institutional blank. I walked away with my hands empty, and a head full of everything we had seen.
The news that day after the detonation, after the decision, spoke of a controlled demolition to prevent structural failure exacerbated by the blackout. It was the sort of statement that fits comfortably into the small world of headlines. Tidy, technical, generically sorrowful. The town on the ridge where the facility had lived, doctors asked Colonel Hayes a script of questions, and he answered with numbers and caution. But there was no public record of specimen tanks. There was no cheery, factual list of how many living things had been inside, or where they'd come from. There were no releases of images that could open sworn mouths. The public story matched the script that had been distributed in the classified briefing, a containment failure with structural compromise necessitating demolition. It was a plausible story because it had the ring of official tragedy. People accept tragedies. They do not always accept mysteries. Debriefing wasn't the same as closure. We had watched our hands perform the scripts of duty, and the tapes of the night had been quieted by authority. But behind the polite words later signed and stamped, there was an internal, cold calculus. The men who had authority had been convinced, either by fear or by system, that the safest course was to remove the facility entirely from the grid. That meant explosives. That meant a crater where there had been rooms and tanks and people. The decision was made in a windowless conference room. The reasoning was economy, in lives, and the calculus had more than one margin it refused to show. I was given a chance to be anywhere after my reassignment. I chose to leave the military a few months later. The reasons people give for leaving are varied and ornate. Mine could be boiled down to a single stubborn thing, the memory of that look pressed against glass. Duty is a heavy cloth. When you leave it, you find the skin beneath is raw. The evacuation night is a mosaic I return to and piece differently every time. There's the sound of distant detonators being armed, pulses through the earth you feel more than hear. There's the image of a small team watching the ridge as black shapes of men in heavy suits move to the charges. There's the instant before the light, a pitch in the chest the way the animal inside you holds its breath for a fall. And then the blast. It was not a cinematic dome of fire. It was a slow, rolling tear that unseated the mountain like a bad tooth pulled in stages. The ground heaved. Windows in the distant town shivered with the pressure. Pictures fell from walls miles away. A plume of rock and dust rose, and the taste of it was mineral and old. For a second, the sky seemed to change its rules, and the stars turned their faces away. When the dust settled, the facility had become an absence.
They called it a structural demolition in briefings. They called it an accident in 2 press releases. The crater remained, a wound in the ridge, and the men in suits who had supervised the charges left with the same calm that attends people who have made decisions it is someone else's job to mourn.
I tried briefly, and with the kind of naive thoroughness only the fresh burned possess, to collect what I could. I filed requests for information through channels designed to be tolerant of denial. I put in a FOIA request that folded back on itself like a wet paper map. I was given redacted documents and denials, and the phrase national security exemption so often it became a song. The reactions I received were professional, the tone of people doing their job. The effect was to teach me that accountability can be designed to look like friction rather than failure. The immediate aftermath was noisier inside than out. Men and women we had worked with were reassigned or retired with pay. Dr. Moreno contacted me once through a sanctioned phone number. He spoke in halting sentences and told me, in a voice that had lost its scientist's precision, that classification is a blunt instrument. He used the word necessary and then corrected himself to inevitable. He said, "We told ourselves we were protecting people," and then he added, "We didn't ask who the people were who needed protecting." He stopped speaking to me. I learned later that he had been offered a contract to continue research under a confidentiality agreement. He chose to accept it, or perhaps he had no option. The man who loved cataloging anomalies traded his temptation for quiet hands. Miguel and Javier looked like men who had been cleaned of color. Miguel developed a tremor in one hand that never fully went away. He moved home to a town that folded him back into itself and then swallowed him. Javier kept at his routine so fiercely that I think they became his armor. I sent them letters sometimes, and they answered with photographs in which they looked smaller. I did not go to court. I did not file lawsuits. Those are the acts of people who think the law will heal a wound that is in part a moral aperture. Instead, I found other ways to mark the memory. I wrote down everything I could remember in notebooks no one asked me to surrender. I drew diagrams. I held on to the photographs I had slipped into my boot that night. Simple things, edges of tanks, a printed page with the words Level 5 scrawled in someone's hand. They were trivial in the face of the hole left in the mountain, but they were mine. I kept them beneath a false bottom in a box until the paper turned soft and the ink began to feather. Time attenuates the body, but not the sense of code. There are evenings now when the world outside is full of unremarkable sounds, the hum of a refrigerator, the distant low of a tractor, and something in the way light from the street catches an edge will pull me back to that glass.
I see the palm, the way the limb had splayed. I imagine what its fingers felt on the polymer. Pressure, curiosity, scent. In my mind's replay, the look it gave me was not only intelligence, but question. Why is your world walled, and mine allowed to be catalogued? On some nights, I dream in electrical patterns. The dreams begin with the environmental monitor's green light, then the amber. They progress to a red so specific I can smell it, then a wave of cold into which I can see bones that are not ours. I wake with an animal ache at the base of my skull. Panic is an ugly, private business that cracks the ribs of your life quietly. It doesn't explode. It corrodes. People who have never been in that room ask me if I'm sure. They ask whether the records exist, whether other witnesses saw what I say. The truth is messy. Some records did exist, and many were taken. Some witnesses were silenced not by law, but by the gentle pressure of reassignment. Others were lost in ways that the public can believe are mundane. I don't insist on an answer to the question of origin, and I refuse the neat label extraterrestrial, because the facts on the table are not mine to crown. What I will say is this: there were living, organized biological entities in a subterranean chamber beneath a mountain that was declared a facility. They were catalogued, measured, frozen, and observed. They were also, at some point, deemed a risk large enough that the authority in charge chose eraser. I do not believe eraser is final. Nothing living buried beneath rock stays still forever, if life has a will and time is a teacher of holes. The mechanics of survival under crush and ash are not my field. I am not a scientist and cannot tell you whether any specimen survived. I can tell you what it feels like to watch an institution choose to bury its complicity under an explosion. That choice leaves layers, and layers become sediment. Sediment can preserve, and sometimes, by the malice of geology, reveal. There is an ethical thing I cannot detach from the night: the moral cost of containment. We had the machines, we have the glass, and we had the forms that let us declare what is a specimen and what is person. In the after hours of my thinking,
I find myself cataloging not only physical events, but moral ones. The moment hands closed with a key in a storeroom. The moment a man in a suit decided that demolition was simplest. The moments when a scientist's curiosity became the justification for containment. We claim safety as the rationale for the hardest deeds, and we do it in the language of calculus. But safety, when it comes at the expense of a being's freedom or life, is a currency that corrodes the people who use it. On quieter days, I picture an afterword to the night that never got written, a hearing where the voices of the living in the tanks could be translated, a court where the question is not, did they pose a threat, but were they given a chance? That world is not the one I live in.
I learned quickly that institutional secrecy is a kind of etiquette, one that will outlive the people who practice it. There were practicalities, too. Years after, I still feel the night scrape of the weld on my shoulder as if it's a tattoo. I had medical checks that were thorough and then redacted. I signed documents that gave up parts of the story in exchange for a quiet life. I watch my hands sometimes and expect to find traces, drops of something on a thumbnail that will explain everything. There are none. Silence does not need evidence to be effective. Compliance is its fuel. Every so often, someone writes to me, usually anonymous, sometimes not, in the way the world now allows. 2 lines, an article link, a photograph of a ridge that looks suspiciously like the place we worked. They ask if it's true. They ask if I think digging would find anything. I tell them what I was told, don't dig. But I also tell them this, because it is how I choose to live with what I know. Look at the world with curiosity, not hunger. Question the tidy statements without accepting every whisper. And guard your conscience, because secrecy lives best where conscience prefers to look away. There is a memory I return to, like a phrase in a language you know you used to speak fluently. After the dust had begun to settle, and men in suits had shaken hands, and the town's stories had told themselves into ordinary forms, there was a moment when I walked the ridge alone at dawn. The crater had cooled to a dark matte scar. A cold wind moved through the rhododendron and carried the grit of stone. I found a small piece of polymer, a shard of a vessel perhaps, sticking out of the earth like a tooth. It was scorched and smooth. I held it in my palm and thought of the eye that had watched me. I do not know if it was curiosity or accusation the eye had carried. They are not exclusive. I do not know whether whatever we destroyed deserved the fate we chose. I do know this: we made a decision about other lives without them at a table. If that thought does not make your skin crawl, then the act of being human with a conscience rests on different bones. Time has given me some distance, and with it a hazard that comes to all veterans, the temptation to turn experience into lesson. I resist lectures. I am not interested in making anyone into a villain or saint. I am interested in a different requirement, accountability to the unknown. There must be ways to meet it that do not begin with clamps and end with dynamite. There must be ways to speak the truth of what we find without collapsing into fear-driven erasure. I am not naive. I know protocols exist for reasons that are not merely administrative. I know contagion is real and threat assessment is necessary. But I also know that secrecy used to protect power and not people is a stone over a grave whose occupant may have been guilty of nothing more terrifying than being unaccounted for.
Sometimes, in the middle of a quiet evening, I pull out the small photographs I kept and look at them. The images, grainy, not composed, capture a curl of a limb pressed to glass, the halo of a data monitor, a line of handwriting someone once scrawled on a printout, level 5, unmapped. They are small and inadequate, and yet they keep the night from being just a rumor. They keep the memory from being a rumor. That is my penance, if one can call it that, to remember clearly enough that forgetting isn't an option I can afford. I do this not to recruit, not to foment panic, but to warn. The Appalachian Blackout was the prelude. Darkness is a blind spot power exploits. When infrastructure fails and the surface world holds its breath, hidden things move, not because they are malicious, but because they have momentum. This is a world where secrets are engineered to persist. If you care, and you should, demand transparency when institutions ask for silence. Ask uncomfortable questions. Push to have moral imagination applied to beings we do not understand. There are safe, ethical routes to research and containment if the people in charge value the difference between protection and imprisonment. My hands still twitch sometimes when I hear the distant thrumming of city power returning after a storm. I think of the day the lights came back and the comfort residents felt when generators sang and bulbs blazed. Light is a small salvation, but light without truth is merely illumination over a closed mouth. If you believe this account deserves more scrutiny, if the idea of lives cataloged in secrecy unnerves you the way it unnerves me, consider this an invitation rather than a conclusion. There are archives, whistleblowers, and investigative paths. Begin with patience and an insistence on verifiable sources. Push for openness where it's safe, and don't accept institutional silence as the end of a story. Above all, keep asking the kind of question that begins with why and doesn't settle for because we said so. If you're interested in deeper looks at similar incidents, testimonies, and documented structural analyses of secret facilities from the era, there are playlists and deep dives that pull together declassified fragments, credible witness accounts, and the context we need to parse nights like that one. Share this story with someone who cares about accountability. Watch, read, and keep the conversation honest, because the mountain keeps scores in the dark, and sometimes what was buried can be coaxed into light by attention and insistence.